That's 349. And we'll sing all four on this one. They bound the hands of Jesus in the garden where he prayed. They led him through the streets in shame. They spat upon going on? They're preparing for the Passover, okay. What else are we told here in verse 1? Okay, so the religious leaders are conspiring against Jesus, and how far away from Passover are we according to this verse? 2 days. We are 2 days away, and then yes, as Andrea pointed out, the religious leaders are conspiring to arrest and kill Jesus, but how are they doing this? What word is there towards the end of the verse? Right before kill. By stealth. By secret, that's what the word stealth means. They're secretly conspiring, and these are things we're just going to touch on in this verse. But yes, we're first told that the Passover and unleavened bread were 2 days away. So this is roughly Tuesday before the crucifixion, with Passover beginning on Thursday, where Jesus would have his Last Supper with his followers. Now also, something else we should understand here, we see that Passover and unleavened bread, they're mentioned together. Initially, those were 2 separate festivals. They're mentioned in Numbers 28, verses 15 and 16, but later, over time, these 2 festivals came to be celebrated together over a period of 8 days or so. So it's at this time that the religious leaders mentioned here were secretly determining how they might arrest and kill Jesus. That's what that word seize means. It means to arrest. Any other questions or comments on verse 1? Okay. So with verse 1 in mind, we go on into verse 2. Mark records, "For they were saying, not during the festival, otherwise there might be a riot of the people." So we've been introduced to the fact that the religious leaders are figuring out how to arrest and kill Jesus, but what are they saying here in verse 2? Why? People have an uprising. Jeremiah, your hand went up. Yeah. So many people there that all these Galileans and all these people from all over are going to be there that believe he is the Messiah, and they don't want to deal with all the people. Exactly. So Jeremiah makes an excellent point. Passover, everybody across the land of Israel, all Jews are in Jerusalem. And so it's very packed. And we've talked a little bit about this because as Jesus and his followers were on the way to Jerusalem, they're not staying in Jerusalem. They're on the outlying villages because Jerusalem is so packed and there wasn't a lot of places to stay. Jeremiah, go ahead. There you go. It would be, especially in Jerusalem at this time. What's that, Andrea? I should have researched that myself. I'm not sure. I know it's a big city because Desiree and I have been there. But as far as numbers, I couldn't tell you. I should have researched that. All right, Jeremiah's looking it up for us. I would have done it myself, but I don't have my phone up here. So 874,000, but there would have been at least twice that at Passover time in Jerusalem. At least almost 100 times the normal population at this time. So this is what the religious leaders are afraid of. There's all these people in Jerusalem. Many of them believe Jesus to be the Messiah. And so this is why they have to do all this secretly, because they're afraid of what's going to happen. And that's what's been driving the religious leaders, is we have seen their fear of Jesus and the fear of his followers all throughout these latter chapters of Mark's gospel. Anything else on verse 2? All right. So having recorded these things, verses 1 and 2, we move on into verse 3, and we begin to read about a story, I should say, or an occasion, where in verse 3, Mark records, while he was in Bethany at the home of Simon the leper, and reclining at the table, there came a woman with an alabaster vial of very costly perfume of pure nard, and she broke the vial and poured it over his head. Now again, at this point, we're moving closer to the crucifixion event. But what's happening here in verse 3? What does the text tell us? Okay, so yeah, this isn't Simon Peter. This is another Simon, and we'll tell more. I'll talk to you a little bit more about him. But what's the occasion here? I mean, he's in Bethany. What's the occasion? What's going on at Simon's house? Probably eating. This is a meal occasion. And so Jesus is in Bethany, which is in one of those towns just outside of Jerusalem. He's reclining at the table, and who comes in? A woman, and what does she do? Okay, do you have oil or perfume there? You have oil? Okay, some of you have ointment, others have oil. The American Standard has perfume. But yes, the point being made here is this woman comes in with this very expensive, again, the American Standard has perfume, but you might have ointment there. Well, there you go. Perfumes are made of oils. So now, so that's the point being made here. We're not going to get caught up in what kind of perfume this was, but Mark is bringing out the fact that it was very expensive. She breaks it, and what does she do? Poured it on his head. So we have these details in mind. With those details in mind, one thing we should understand here is that the occasion Mark describes here is probably the same one we read about in Matthew 26, verses 6 through 14, and possibly the same one that we read about in John chapter 12, verses 1 through 8. Now, if all these occasions are the same, the woman we're reading about here is the woman we know as Mary. Mary, the sister of Martha and Lazarus. Lazarus being the one that Jesus raised from the dead. And then we have this individual, Simon the leper. All we can know for certain is that he was probably a relative of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. Possibly their father, but again, we don't know for certain. All we know about this Simon is what we read here. He was a leper. But Mark's point here is not about these individuals, but rather about what happened on this occasion, where the woman essentially anointed Jesus with this expensive perfume over his head. And if we parallel this with John chapter 12, she also did so on his feet, wiped her hair on his feet. Anything else on verse 3? They were outcasts, that's true. Exactly. So these are the people Jesus spent most of his time with, was the outcast of society. Anything else on, go ahead, Jeremiah. Right. Yeah, and this was very significant. And what this woman does exhibit who she believes Jesus to be. Now, she probably doesn't really quite comprehend what's coming. Probably doesn't comprehend why what she did was so significant. But this is what Jesus is going to bring out as we get into the main portion of this that we're going to look at today. But anything else on verse 3? Okay. So again, verses 1 through 3 are kind of the stage-setting verses that set the stage for what Mark is going to go on to discuss in verses 4 through 9, where Mark makes 2 points about how the people on the occasion reacted to what this woman did. So the first point Mark makes in verses 4 and 5 is that some were angry with this woman for anointing Jesus. But then in verses 6 through 9, we see the other side of the coin in that Jesus was pleased with the woman anointing him. Now, after looking at these things, then what we'll learn from these verses is that we must see the anointing of Jesus as Jesus saw it. So that in mind, let's read verses 4 through 9, and then we'll look at the points. Again, this is Mark 14, beginning in verse 4. We read, "But some were indignantly remarking to one another, 'Why has this perfume been wasted? For this perfume might have been sold for over 300 denarii and the money given to the poor.' And they were scolding her. But Jesus said, 'Let her alone. Why do you bother her? She has done a good deed to me. For you always have the poor with you, and whenever you wish, you can do good to them, but you do not always have me. She has done what she could. She has anointed my body beforehand for the burial. Truly I say to you, wherever the gospel is preached in the whole world, what this woman has done will also be spoken of in memory of her.'" So again, these verses that we're going to be spending time with are all about how people reacted to what this woman did. Point number 1, some were angry with this woman. We begin to see that in verse 4. What are we told in verse 4? They were saying it was wasted. How are they feeling according to this verse? They're indignant. What does that mean, indignant? Angry. That's exactly what it means. We might say in some cases it's a righteous anger, but Jesus is going to show this is not exactly a righteous anger that they're experiencing, but they are angry. And they're asking, why has this perfume been wasted? Why ask that question? What were we just told about the perfume? It was expensive. Jeremiah, you had your hand up. Okay. That's true. Right. Right. Judas, yes, we do know from the other Gospels that Judas is the instigator of all this. But yes, the question is asked, why has this perfume been wasted? It's so expensive. And people, one of those being Judas, is angry. And this brings us into verse 5, where we'll talk about the 300 denarii. But anything else on verse 4? Okay. So verse 5, verse 4, we saw that they're angry. What comes out in verse 5? She's answering all the questions. So, she might be answering the question, she might not. But it could have been sold. For how much? denarii. And as Jeremiah pointed out, that's 300 days' wages. But their mindset is, this perfume's expensive. It could have been given to the poor. First of all, sold, and the money from that sale given to the poor. And how are they treating the woman? Is that how yours reads? Criticized? Okay. New American Standard has scolding, but that is the idea of getting on to the woman, for lack of a better term, or criticizing, as Casey's reads. But we're told the amount that it could have been sold for. Jeremiah said that's 300 days' wages. That's true. But in today's money, that probably would have been roughly a little over $200. That was the research I came to. But that's a lot of money. There are $200 perfumes out there, even more expensive. And it could have been given to the poor. Their mindset's right, to help the poor, and that's something Jesus is going to touch on here in a few moments. But this is why they're angry, because in their mind, it's been wasted. It could have been sold, money given to the poor. Questions or comments on verse 5? Okay. So we're looking at how people reacted to what the woman did. Verses 4 and 5, the point here is that some were angry with the woman for anointing Jesus. From verse 5, we know that one reason they were angry with the woman is because in their minds she had wasted the perfume when it could have been sold for a great amount and the money given to the poor. And so they viewed what the woman had done as something wasteful instead of beneficial. And that brings us into verses 6 through 9, where we look at Jesus' reaction. He was pleased with the woman for doing what she'd done. So this point is introduced with Mark beginning to record some words from Jesus. In verse 6, what does Jesus say? Leave her alone. Why does he say that according to verse 6? She did a beautiful thing for him. Is that how yours reads? A beautiful thing? Oh, that's cool. New American Standard just says she has done a good deed. So what's Jesus' mindset here? She didn't do anything wrong. Quite the opposite. She did something good. So Jesus says, leave the woman alone. She didn't do anything wrong. Questions or comments on verse 6? Okay, verse 7. What else does Jesus say in verse 7? And what else does he say after that? You'll not always have me. Okay. So these people have been wanting to take care of the poor. They said we could have done this, taking care of the poor. Was that wrong? To want to take care of the poor? Okay, everybody's shaking their head. No. So, but Jesus says what he says here. What's he saying? We see what the text says, but what's he saying when he says these words in verse 7? What's his point? Put him first. Now, Jesus is not condemning these individuals for wanting to take care of the poor. But what he's saying is there's something more important going on right now than taking care of the poor. The poor you will always have with you, but they would not always have Jesus. What's he helping them to understand here? What's about to happen? He's going to be gone. And how is he going to leave? He's going to get crucified. He's been telling them this up to this point in these latter chapters of Mark's gospel, that he is going to be crucified. So on this particular occasion, taking care of the poor is not as important as what's going to happen with Jesus. So he says, you're always going to have the poor. You're always going to have the opportunity to help the poor. If you don't believe what Jesus says, just go up to Salt Lake. find a lot of poor people up there. You find them here in our little neck of the woods. So what Jesus says is true. There's always going to be an opportunity to help the poor. But there's not going to be an opportunity to serve Jesus in the way that he was being served on this occasion. Questions or comments on verse 7? All right, so again, Jesus' point here is that in this particular case, it was more important to take care of Jesus in this way than it was to take care of the poor. So as a result of these things, in verse 8, what has this woman done? What does it mean to anoint? What's that, Jessica? Not in this particular case. To prepare. It's to anoint. It's this language about preparing Jesus for burial. Jesus says she's done what she could. And this is why he's pleased with her, because she was doing something to prepare Jesus for his burial, which of course happens after the crucifixion. And so this is what was most important at this time. And as was said before, this is exhibiting her belief in who Jesus is. Anything else on verse 8? So we come to verse 9. How does Jesus end his teaching here? What does he say? Okay. So what does this tell us about how Jesus is feeling about what this woman did? It's almost as important as the gospel. Now, what's the gospel in its simplest sense? Okay, that's what the word means, but what's our good news? Death, burial, and resurrection. That is the gospel in its very simplest sense. Now, I bring this to our attention because we should notice here that Jesus uses the phrase, the gospel. He doesn't lay it out, but he is putting in his hearer's mind the death, burial, and resurrection. Now, I bring that out because, again, Jesus has already been telling his followers about this event before this point. So his point here is that when everybody hears the gospel, when the gospel is preached, when people communicate that message, what this woman has done will be spoken of. And that's why Mark records it. Because he knew of Jesus' words. He was there when he spoke them. And so what Jesus says here carries with the idea that when that good news is preached, what this woman had done would be spoken in remembrance of her. Now, the woman herself, she doesn't really comprehend this at this point. But she's done something significant. Because she's preparing Jesus for the cross, preparing him for his burial that would be followed by his resurrection. Questions or comments on verse 9? All right. Putting verses 6 through 9 together, the point we should see about the woman anointing Jesus is that Jesus was pleased with the woman for anointing him. In these verses, Mark has shown that Jesus was pleased with what she'd done. More specifically, Mark has shown that Jesus saw what the woman had done as a good deed or a beautiful thing, if that's how yours reads. As a result, this woman was not to be scolded. Instead, she was to be honored for what she had done. Now, verse 9 of this section shows that one way this woman would be honored for what she had done is by others speaking about what she had done wherever the gospel is preached in the whole world. So when we put everything we've studied in verses 1 through 9 together, the point we should be left with is that this woman anointed Jesus. Some were angry with the woman for doing this, but Jesus was pleased with the woman for anointing him. And so what we should learn from these verses is that we must see the anointing of Jesus as Jesus saw it. Now, based on what we study in these verses, there's one of two reactions we can have toward this, what this woman did for Jesus. Like some of these people, we could be angry for wasting such an expensive thing. Or we can honor this woman for using her expensive perfume to anoint Jesus and prepare him for his death and burial. Now, if we have the reaction that Jesus calls us to have, we'll be honoring this woman and remember her whenever the gospel is preached. Now, again, those are just some applications from this text to us. Any other questions or comments? All right. Well, Jeremiah, would you close us again with prayer? Thanks, man.